Think about the last time your pet walked into the room. Maybe it was a dog settling its chin on your knee without being asked. Maybe it was a cat choosing your lap out of every available surface in the house. Maybe it was something smaller, a rabbit, a bird, a creature that has no evolutionary reason to seek out human contact, and yet somehow keeps doing it anyway. Whatever the animal, whatever the moment, something happened in your brain in that instant. A small but measurable shift. A drop in cortisol. A rise in oxytocin. The same neurochemical signature your brain produces when you see someone you love. You didn't decide to feel that. It just happened. And here is the question that almost nobody ever thinks to ask. How long has that been happening? Not just in your lifetime, not just in your culture. How far back does that specific feeling go? The answer is older than any civilization, older than any religion, older than almost anything else we would recognize as human culture, and the evidence for it is sitting in the ground, waiting to be found, in the form of something so simple it should stop you cold. A hand, a human hand, buried deliberately on top of a puppy, 5,000 years ago, arranged as if still reaching out to touch it. Start at the beginning, because the beginning matters here. For most of the 20th century, the dominant scientific assumption about the human-animal bond was that it was essentially a modern luxury, a product of surplus, the idea being that only people with enough food, enough safety, and enough leisure time could afford to keep animals around that served no immediate practical purpose. A dog that wasn't hunting, a cat that wasn't catching rats, a bird that wasn't being eaten. The assumption was that emotional attachment to animals was a late development, something that emerged once civilization had solved enough of its basic problems to allow for sentiment. Then the archaeology started proving that assumption completely wrong, one burial site at a time. The oldest confirmed evidence of deliberate animal burial alongside a human being comes from a site in northern Israel called Ein Malaha, dated to approximately 12,000 years ago. An elderly human, likely a woman based on skeletal analysis, was found buried with her hand resting on the skeleton of a puppy. The positioning was not accidental. The puppy had been placed carefully beside her. Her hand had been arranged to rest on its body. Whatever beliefs surrounded death in that community 12,000 years ago, whoever this woman was, someone decided that she and this animal belonged together even in burial. Archaeologist Simon Davis, who studied the site extensively, argued that this single find overturned the idea that emotional attachment to animals was a recent or luxury development. This was not a civilized society with surplus time for sentiment. This was a hunter-gatherer community living at the edge of survival, and they still buried their dead with the animals they loved. That site is not an outlier. It is the beginning of a pattern that shows up across the full span of human history, with a consistency that is impossible to dismiss. Dog burials alongside human remains have been found across ancient Mesopotamia, across prehistoric Europe, across early Native American sites, across ancient China, across archaeological sites in sub-Saharan Africa. In every case, the positioning and the deliberateness of the placement tell the same story. These were not food animals disposed of ceremonially, these were individuals, treated at death the way you would treat a member of the family. A site in Skatholm, Sweden, dating to roughly 7,000 years ago, contains some of the most detailed evidence of the emotional weight placed on animal companions in prehistoric communities. Multiple dog skeletons were found buried with grave goods, including antler ornaments and ochre pigment, the same ritual materials buried with the highest status human members of the community, not beside them, with the same level of individual ceremonial treatment. A researcher named Lars Larsen at Lund University, who led excavations at the site for years, concluded that these animals were not being honored as symbols or tools. They were being honored as individuals. The community was grieving specific animals the way it grieved specific people. This is where the science of what actually happens in the human brain during pet attachment becomes relevant, because it reframes those ancient burials entirely. In 2014, neuroscientist Morten Kringelbach at the University of Oxford published research showing that the neural response humans have to infant faces, the neurological signature of the caregiving instinct, is activated almost identically by images of baby animals. The same structures, the same activation pattern, the same flood of affiliative hormones. Your brain, quite literally, does not fully distinguish between caring for a human infant and caring for a young animal at a neurological level. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable biological response. And because this response is tied to systems in the brain that are evolutionarily ancient, systems that predate language, that predate culture, that predate civilization entirely, it is almost certainly not a modern development. The ancient humans who buried their dogs with ochre and antler ornaments were running the same neurological software you run when your dog puts its chin on your knee. The hardware was already there. It has always been there. But here's the part of the story that complicates the comfortable narrative. Not every ancient culture treated its animals the way a modern pet owner would recognize. The relationship between humans and animals in the ancient world was layered, contradictory, and often brutal by contemporary standards. The same cultures that buried dogs with ceremonial care also killed dogs as ritual sacrifices. The same communities that kept cats as companions also had no hesitation about eating them when food was scarce. The ancient Egyptians, who venerated cats so completely that harming one could be punishable by death, also mummified enormous quantities of cats, specifically as religious offerings, mass-producing them in temple breeding programs in ways that bear no resemblance to how a modern person treats a beloved pet. The distinction between a companion animal and a resource animal was not fixed or universal in the ancient world the way modern Western culture tends to treat it. It was fluid, context-dependent, shaped by survival pressures that most modern pet owners have never faced. This matters because it asks a harder version of the question. When we ask whether ancient humans loved their pets, we are really asking whether they experienced the same quality of emotional attachment that the modern relationship implies. And the honest answer from the research is that they almost certainly felt the bond as deeply. What differed was not the feeling, but the context surrounding it. Anthropologist Darcy Morey at Radford University, who has spent decades studying the archaeological record of human-animal relationships, argues that the emotional capacity for pet attachment is biologically embedded in the human species and shows no evidence of being a recent cultural development. What changes across time and culture is not whether the attachment exists, but how that attachment is expressed, protected, and balanced against other survival pressures. Think about what it would have meant to form an emotional bond with an animal 12,000 years ago. You are in a mobile hunter-gatherer group. Resources are unpredictable. Danger is constant. Every calorie matters. Keeping an animal alive requires feeding it, which means sharing food you cannot guarantee you will be able to replace. Keeping a dog means tolerating noise that could attract predators. It means carrying an animal that cannot walk when it is injured. It means accepting a degree of vulnerability, the grief of potential loss, that serves no immediate survival function at all. And yet they did it, over and over, across every continent where humans lived. The decision to form that bond in conditions of genuine scarcity is not the behavior of a species that stumbled accidentally into pet ownership. It is the behavior of a species for whom the emotional reward of the bond was strong enough to justify the cost, strong enough to override the calculus of pure survival. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most human things there is. There is a specific piece of evidence that has stayed with researchers who study this period for a reason that is difficult to articulate scientifically, but impossible to ignore emotionally. At a site in Bonn-Oberkassel in Germany, dated to approximately 14,000 years ago, a dog skeleton was found buried alongside two humans. Analysis of the dog's remains showed that the animal had been severely ill for the last months of its life, suffering from a disease called canine distemper that would have left it incapacitated, unable to hunt, unable to work, unable to offer any practical utility to the group, and yet it had been kept alive, fed, cared for. The illness lasted months. Someone, or more likely multiple people, made the decision repeatedly over that time to keep this sick dog alive, to use resources to sustain an animal that was giving nothing back in functional terms, and when it died, they buried it with ceremony. Researchers Leon Guillaume and Ralf Schmitz, who analyzed the site, described this as the strongest direct evidence yet found that the emotional bond between humans and dogs in the prehistoric period was not conditional on the animal's usefulness. They kept it alive because they did not want it to die. That is not resource management. That is love. Or something close enough to love that the distinction may not matter. So come back to your pet walking into the room. The weight of that moment is heavier than it looks. That small neurological shift, the drop in cortisol, the rise in oxytocin, the involuntary softening that happens before you have consciously registered what you are feeling is not a modern indulgence. It is not a product of surplus or civilization or a culture that has grown too comfortable to remember what survival costs. It is something that was already running in human nervous systems before agriculture existed, before cities existed, before writing existed, before almost anything we point to as the beginning of human culture had begun. The woman at Ain Malaha 12,000 years ago, her hand resting on the puppy buried beside her, was feeling something in the same family as what you feel right now. The animal that walked into your room and chose to be near you is continuing a relationship that is, in the deepest possible sense, as old as anything that makes us human. You did not learn to love your pet. You were built to.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button right up there and check out this awesome video too.